Welcome to the Real Estate Forum, a podcast from the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at Columbia Business School. I'm your host, Raphael Sidelsky. This is your place for key insights into the evolving real estate landscape, from candid conversations with real estate thought leaders, including the esteemed faculty of the MBA Real Estate Program, to cutting-edge research from the Milstein Center's Research Lab. Let's dive in. Today's guest is a leader of a transatlantic single-family office with a focus on real estate and related investments, and one of the most thoughtful voices on how design, wellness, and sustainability are transforming the office sector. Sabine Gaedeke Stener is the CEO of Elbe River Partners and the CEO of Gaedeke Group and Gaedeke Energy, with offices in Hamburg and Dallas. Born and educated in Germany and based in the US, Sabina has built a distinctive real estate portfolio with a philosophy rooted in placemaking, wellness, and long-term value creation. From Class A office towers across the US to a cutting-edge energy portfolio, she's led Gaedeke's evolution into a forward-looking family office that defies trends and defines what's next. Sabina, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Sabina, before we jump into your personal journey, please tell us about Elbe River Partners and Gaedeke Group with an overview on your real estate focus areas in the US and Europe.
Sure. So we are based in Dallas and in Hamburg. In Europe, we're predominantly focused on continuous care retirement communities and multifamily, largely in inner cities. And in the US, we are focused on office largely, and we're also doing some transformations into hospitality. But because of our laser-like focus in the US on just one food type, one asset class, where we started as a pure real estate owner and operator, we kind of have evolved into four distinct verticals under Elbe River Partners as a holding company. And that is real estate, which is the office, energy, debt, and then private equity. And then each vertical obviously serves different market cycles. Energy creates consistent cash flow regardless of the real estate conditions because we're selling into the spot market. Debt investments perform particularly well in the current environment where rates are high, credit is tight, and then real estate and venture are our growth plays where markets are expanding. And so that creates this flywheel effect where we're always deploying capital somewhere, always generating returns that can fund the next opportunity.
That's great. And I love the example of the robotics investment you made. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's an example of, we have these four verticals, but they're still all revolving around what we know, which is real estate. So our private equity focus stays rooted in what we understand. And one of our investments is a window cleaning robotics company. And their robot just weighs about 9 kilograms. And instead of two people hanging off of the side of a building, this robot can wash the window day or night. And you also don't have the kind of privacy issues that you tend to have when you're sitting in your office and you're doing something and the guy's just clanging from the outside of the facade. So this is like a proposition that we can evaluate because we live in the world of high-rise buildings. And that's just one example. I mean, we have many others in construction and project management, energy management. There's so much low-hanging fruit in real estate, as you well know.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great example. Let's go back to your background. What's fascinating is you came to Dallas over 3 decades ago with 2 suitcases and a stack of operating statements from your father. Tell us about what led to that moment.
Yeah, so I was actually taking a sabbatical at the time from working in media. And I had worked for Bertelsmann in Germany, which at the time was the second largest media company in the world after Time Warner. And we were building a pan-European pay TV network, which is actually ended up being the precursor of what is today Sky. And I was on my way to Los Angeles to visit with a friend. And my dad had purchased a few assets in Dallas and basically wanted to figure out whether to hold on to them. And so I came to Dallas to have a look. And I had previously to that long resolved that I wasn't going to work for my dad. But then, I came to Dallas. It was a cool city. And there was a 5,000-mile buffer zone. Then it helped that the guy that moved in next to me in the corporate apartment was cute. And we've been married now for 30 years. So that's how I kind of got stuck. And that initial set of properties realized unprecedented returns and formed the basis of our US operations.
Wow. A lot of fortuitous things coming together there. As a former architect who began my career working in Berlin for a bit, I was excited to hear that your father was an architect and started the business there. So tell us about how the family business got started and how it evolved.
I had no idea you were an architect. So my dad grew up in Berlin after World War II in the American sector. And everything was in ruins. And he became a huge fan of everything American because the GIs would give him candy and chewing gum and so on and so forth. And since Germany was in ruins, he became an architect to help rebuild the country. And then after he made some money, his idea of diversification was, the same asset class across two continents. And he started in New York, just like every European, and then came to Dallas because of the loan and savings crisis in the 80s that ensued in the 80s, and especially here in Texas and in Dallas. And what happened was they formed a resolution trust company, the RTC, that then was selling off all of these distressed assets. It was a huge market dislocation. And I think they sold off like some $400 billion in assets in the early 90s to the highest bidder, and there weren't many. And that was at a time when 400 billion still was quite a lot of money, not like today, And my father looked at those relatively new assets. They were like 3 to 5 years old, something like that, through his architect's eyes, and just realized that this was a once in a generation chance at buying into something at the ground floor.
Yeah, well, your father clearly had great foresight, but still, what drew you away from the exciting world of media, and how did you get comfortable in real estate land?
So it's really funny. I listened to this interview with the Danish-American architect Bjarke Ingels the other day, and he was telling his story of how he became an architect. And it turns out he grew up in Copenhagen and wanted to be a graphic novels author, so he wanted to draw. But the university in Copenhagen didn't have any faculty for that. So the only place where you could learn how to draw was an architecture school. So that's what he signed up for. And then he kind of started drawing buildings and falling in love with it, with what he now calls the framework for life, buildings, the surroundings, the real estate and everything. And his story resonated with me so well because I ended up with the same passion. So I came here and I looked at this stuff and started thinking, okay, what can we do with this? Where can this go? And I feel so honored to be contributing and serving the communities that we work with in our projects, and hopefully enhance life for the better for everyone, or if not for everyone, for the vast majority of people. I love placemaking. I love design. We are a very design-driven company, and I love communities. I love watching communities evolve, and trying to reimagine and enhance what's there. And so I would call it the fabric of life rather than Bjarke's framework, but basically both after the same outcome, and that is enhancing the human experience. So that's my long-winded answer of why real estate. I love it.
That's a wonderful response. And tell us about the early days. How did you immerse yourself into real estate, and how did that Bertelsmann background actually help you in ways that probably most people wouldn't think about?
Yeah, so the beginning was very hands-on, because when you're buying distressed assets, and mind you, these were not physically distressed assets. These were largely new or newish assets, but they were essentially empty. And so job number one was filling them up. So I rolled up my sleeves and ran our leasing efforts for almost the first decade of our existence. And I had to understand every aspect of what makes tenants choose one space over the other. And in a weird way, my media background actually turned out to be my secret weapon, because everybody else was thinking about real estate as square footage and lease rates. And I was thinking of it in the context of content creation and audience experience. So how do you build a brand? How do you create consistent, repeatable experiences that people want to be part of? Do you tell a story that resonates? And I was essentially applying media principles to real estate. And what's the narrative? What's the user experience? And the more I dove in, the more addicted I became, because real estate isn't just about buildings. It's about the human behavior. It's about market psychology. It's about community building. And every lease negotiation taught me something. Every tenant interaction revealed insights about what people actually want versus what they say they want. I'm sure you've been in that situation before too. And you just can't learn this business just from spreadsheets alone. You learn it from standing in empty spaces and imagining what they could become. And sometimes those empty spaces are literally empty spaces in your building, and sometimes it's just an infill location somewhere that wants to be something. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And Gaedeke Group is known for long-term holds and transformative remodels. How do you decide between tackling a ground-up development or going into a major redevelopment?
Both of them have a distinctive charm, although repositioning and adaptive reuse is one much more sustainable, and B, much more challenging. And I oftentimes think it's also a little bit more rewarding than building from scratch. There's this European idea of real estate as the Crown's discipline. And we, as a company with a European pedigree, have some of that ingrained in our thinking, because buildings are not throwaway items. So it takes a long time to create and to build. It's very costly. And if you missed it and it isn't fit or good enough for its intended purpose, you can't just tear it down. You got to work with it. So there is this permanence to real estate that is both the attraction and also the detriment of placemaking. And mistakes have really, really long-term consequences. So careful planning and repositioning of existing assets is vital. And in our company history, because we have such long hold periods, I think we've done probably more repositioning or reimagining of assets than actually building from scratch. So if you have a great location, you've got lasting structural integrity, timeless architectural elements, and flexibility for future uses, then you reposition. And that said, building from scratch is also really, really fun, and with a lot less headaches in many cases. The last two ones we did was a multi-tenant office building in Plano, Texas, which is like in the Dallas Metroplex. And the other thing is a single-tenant office building in the government district of Berlin for the German Women's and Children's Ministry. So the former was developed on a cow pasture, where the move of Toyota created an instant live, work, play environment with at the time, over 20,000 jobs in the immediate vicinity within 4 years. And then the latter was literally a core urban infill location. Something had to be torn down. And it took a long time to get the entitlements, but then the construction was pretty straightforward. I believe in the US, even now, it seems counterintuitive, but from a carbon footprint, there's quite a difference in adaptive reuse or transformation versus new building. And I believe actually in the US, this philosophy over the last 30 years has been changing too. So from this tear it down and rebuild mentality to preserve what's there. And there's some stunning architecture in this country that really deserves preserving.
Well, absolutely. And it's, more environmentally sound to preserve what's there as well.
Yeah.
You talked about Bjarke Engels earlier and his framework for life. How does that philosophy translate into your actual investment decisions? And what makes a project worthy of the Gaedeke name?
So our core purpose that everyone that works here has on their desk or in their office is we create environments for everyone, partners, coworkers, clients, to be successful. That is our guiding star. And that's inward looking and outward looking. That also pertains, like I said, to coworkers. And I think that's very similar to Bjarke's framework definition, which is why it resonated to me so much. We know as an office landlord that we're not successful unless our tenants are successful. So our investment decisions into real estate are driven by what we feel we can make out of an asset, what people need to thrive in those assets, and the value we can bring to the table with our expertise, either in reimagining it or into whatever it wants to be, or enhancing what it already is to make it optimal, to kind of bring it to its best and highest use, the classic real estate motto. We are definitely not a company that buys something and then clips the coupon. We are actively shaping the real estate that we own, and oftentimes reshape it several times during our hold periods, like I said before. But a lot of our real estate has certain characteristics, and it's usually in markets that are either in growth or transition mode. The properties themselves have really good bones. They're not, the equivalent of a burner phone. And then we really go to town with them. So we add wellness amenities, we convert, we do technology infrastructure, we do sustainable improvements. We really kind of hone in on what you sometimes see in Europe, where you walk into an old facade and you have a brand new building behind the facade. We kind of try to do the same thing here.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about One Legacy West. You mentioned it earlier, and how you transformed the cow pasture into this vibrant mixed-use environment. And I think it's a great example of your desire to create this global sensibility where everybody can feel at home in one of your buildings.
That project was delivered before the pandemic. And that is very important to note, because it is still as fresh today as when it was delivered. And it gave us a lot of learnings. For background, so Toyota America announced in 2014 that they would move their US headquarters from Torrance, California to Plano, Texas, which is a 300,000 population suburb of North Dallas, which, park that for a minute, 300,000 is a city somewhere else, but here it's a suburb. And this had been going on for a while, and it was rumored that they would come to North Texas. And we had an option on land that was directly across from what was rumored to be their new campus location. And on the day of the press release, we converted our option into a PSA, because we said, okay, we're gonna build a building. And it was a huge announcement for Dallas-Fort Worth, even in a long string of corporate relocations before and since. And so we were sitting in our offices and we were shooting the breeze, and we were thinking, okay, so there will be suppliers to Toyota sitting in North Korea, in Japan, in Germany right now, reading this press release and saying, where the heck in the world is Plano, Texas? And the next thought right after that is, we need an office there. And so we were literally saying, okay, what would be a day in the life of our new tenant? We decided, okay, we're going to build an office building that reads Class A, comfortable, and hit all the high notes that you need, regardless of where you hail from in the world. And so we really took our cues from the inside out, the day off, right? So we created a state-of-the-art tenant lounge where you could kind of come in after a long flight, plunk yourself down, and either check on your emails, call your family, like little telephone rooms and meditation rooms where you can just sit in peace and quiet. The building has outdoor spaces if you want to have fresh air and just kind of sit there for a little bit. It has a fitness facility with towel service and saunas and showers that if you came off of a long flight, you can kind of freshen up and get ready for your meeting. And the gym rivals any Equinox. It has a commissary, which is not just a deli. It's a little sit-down restaurant where you can have a decent meal. We have complimentary bikes because it's right next to a bike and hiking trail if you wanted to do that. It has shuttle to the retail corridor, which is like a half a mile away. And it has air. It has 15-foot ceilings. It has floor-to-ceiling windows with open plenums. And so we really felt we designed something that's a home away from home where you can really work. We have everything that you need. And, it worked out beautifully. That's like the greatest reward that you get when you design something and people actually end up using it. And the building is now its own little ecosystem, despite the fact that, it is now surrounded by JP Morgan's Texas campus, which is the largest, that campus employs more people than JP Morgan employs in the state of New York. FedEx, JCPenney, Toyota, and many more. But it just has been a really exciting experience. And we took a lot from what we did there and then implemented it across our portfolio. And by the way, I have no idea whether any of our tenants have ever lived that day in the life of that we imagined that they would live.
Well, you've clearly got the vision and the imagination of an architect, and then you put it to work. So we got to check with your tenants. But I wanted to dive into your wellness initiative and what you call WellSpace, and tell us how that came about during the pandemic and its lasting benefits.
Yeah, so that was a wild time for all of us, especially office landlords, right? So we were luckily on the right side of the bell curve when the pandemic hit. So from the learnings from the building that I was just describing to you, we already owned buildings in great locations, and they had amenities that became essential. And then in addition to that, we did a lot of upgrades to the environmental systems as well. But we already had Zen rooms and meditation spaces. We had small breakouts. We had outdoor spaces where you could go into the fresh air. We offer complimentary bikes in many locations. So we already had a lot of spaces where people kind of could divert to instead of all sitting on top of each other. But as everybody else, we were literally trying to rebuild the airplane as we were flying it at the time. How do you swiftly transport people up an elevator cab that, if you have 6 feet that you have to have between 2 people, you can probably take, in most elevator cabs, 2 people at a time. How do you even stage egress and ingress in front of your elevator lobbies? Your restrooms, every restroom stall is closer than 6 feet from the next one. There were so many things that were going on at the time. It was crazy. We ended up really diving into it. We were one of the first companies in the nation to get the FitWell viral certification, and really tried to figure out, what do we do if we have a case of COVID on a floor? What is our protocol? What is our cleaning protocol? And then beyond that, we looked at air filtration systems and ended up upgrading our entire portfolio with bipolar ionization, which is the same air purification technology that they use in hospitals to basically wash out 99% of all pathogens out of the air. And we did that everywhere, including tenant spaces, common areas, elevators. And when we looked at the cost of retrofitting, when we first were trying to figure out what we were going to do about this, and by the way, this is not in a Fitwell thing. It doesn't give you any points on leads or on Fitwell or on Well. They don't give you points for air purification. But when we looked at that, we were scratching our heads because it was really not that expensive per square foot to put in. And it's totally justified, even if you have a bad flu season. If the occupants in your building, if less people get sick because they don't get coughed at, or, they walk into an elevator that somebody just coughed their heart out and they get sick that way, then it was already worth it. So all of those learnings from those early days of the pandemic, combined with our focus on creating spaces for people to thrive, then created our WellSpace initiative, where we said, okay, it's the stuff you can see, but it's also the stuff you can't see. And we want you to be well in our buildings. So that's how that came about.
Sabina, you have a differentiated strategy when it comes to sustainability that goes beyond certification standards. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so close to 90% of our portfolio is LEED certified, but I feel that LEED is a little past its prime because it's focused on the envelope, the sticks and bricks, using sustainable materials. But that's really only the starting point. Our focus has really evolved to be much more occupant-centric. So how does the space make you feel? Is it conducive to your workflow, the pattern of collaboration? And how do you want to spend your workday? And I think the data shows that that's very transformative. So, you have 20% decreased absenteeism, you have higher well-being, you have more creativity. And really, I think we as an industry are moving beyond traditional green buildings, but more to like the human-centered wellness real estate. And the industry is really recognizing this shift, in my opinion. And this approach integrates just multiple wellness layers. Like we said before, we, for instance, use biophilic design principles. We put green spaces into our buildings or around our buildings. We put in pocket parks. And it's really multisensory environments, that engage you visually, auditorily, tactile, and even olfactory. I mean, we have scent programs in our buildings. I mean, when was the last time you walked into a building and you said, hey, it smells good here? There are a lot of us that are doing this now, and it really certifiably adds to your well-being. So all of this is, or for instance, natural light that you see it, the air quality that we already talked about, and then acoustics. Everybody wants to have high planips. Well, can you still hear yourself talk in many of these where nobody really thought about? You still need to be able to have a private conversation. So these are all ingredients, ingredients for a great building, recipes for a great building. And, it all creates then a environment that people want to be in.
No, absolutely. It's great that you think about all the senses in your approach. And, Europe has always been much further along when it comes to sustainability. How has that piece of things informed your approach in the US?
Early on, when we started, we already brought a lot of the concepts from Europe over here. So we've used green cleaning products in order to keep things as chemical light as possible. We used recycled paper products in restrooms. We have touchless dispensers. We even provide complimentary feminine hygiene products in all restrooms. It's always puzzled me why there are these 25-cent machines for those when toilet paper is free. These details matter because they show we're thinking about the complete human experience. And the business case is obviously compelling, but I think in many ways the US has caught up to what Europe has been doing, except for when it comes to overall investments.
You also, in addition to caring about the people in your buildings, you're very community oriented, and you talk about your properties as living ecosystems. How does that translate into your engagement with tenants and the broader community?
What it really means is we're not just landlords collecting rent, but we consider ourselves community builders. And everything I've described really comes together to create environments where people really want to spend time and not have to spend time. So we actively foster belonging. We sponsor even places in the neighborhood, like we sponsor parks, like the Clyde Warren Park here in Dallas, which is like one of the most, if not the most successful deck park recently, in recent memory. And the Underline in Miami, which is the answer to New York's High Line, where they kind of created a park. The sun always shines, so they created a park underneath a high rail. Both are very well received, and we encourage people to kind of do that, hiking hiking trails, biking trails, that kind of stuff. And we even go beyond that. We regularly survey our tenants, and not just about maintenance issues, but about what would make their daily lives better. And then we implement some of it or all of it. And then there are beautiful surprises. And one of our buildings has a ping pong table, a pretty professional one. And we have this incredible group of tenants that are very serious about their ping pong. They bring their own paddles, not the ones that we supply. And they organize regular tournaments, and they crown a building's champion. And, when you see that level of engagement, people creating their own traditions and competing for bragging rights, then you've built a community. And for all the detractions, Adam Newman and WeWork got one thing absolutely right 15 years ago, and that is people crave belonging at work. And it's not necessarily the beer taps at 3 p.m., but that sense of this is my place, these are my people. And when tenants organize their own activities, that's when you've created this living ecosystem. And the building is more than four walls at this point. It becomes part of their story.
Absolutely. Your passion for office clearly shines through, but office itself, the sector, has run into a lot of headwinds of late. You had the pandemic, work from home, and now we have the assault of artificial intelligence and the large language models. So tell us a little bit about, where you think office has come from and where it's going to, and why you still remain so passionate about the business.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, those are two very significant headwinds. But if you think about it, it's uncanny. Office is the youngest asset class because it was really born out of the shop factory floors 150 years ago during the Industrial Revolution, right? It wasn't even an asset class until then. And then it became bigger, and then it was in separate rooms, and then it was in separate buildings. And even over these last 150 years, it's changed massively. And we don't need to go through the whole history, but remember when they had those 60, 70, 80,000 square foot floor plates, and there was permanent darkness in the middle of those things. You couldn't even see outside. So the advent of technology over the last 50 years have changed the way we work and what the office looks like. So I think that will continue. I mean, AI has made it such that knowledge work is dying because, what was the difference between your and my shop and Blackstone? They could throw 20 bodies at a problem and had the answer within days. And you and I, we had fewer bodies to throw at it, and it took us weeks or months, and we couldn't compete. That is out the window, or about to be out the window, because AI will write you investment memos and analyses out the yin yang in a fraction of the time. So in that, work will change. I do think that the remote work thing has kind of come to a equilibrium. I remember during the pandemic in May of 2020, Gensler, the architectural firm, had a survey where they surveyed office occupants, and they asked them, do you ever want to go back to work in an office? And in May of 2020, 70% of the respondents said, no, never. We can do everything we want from home. We don't need to go to an office. And then they repeated the same thing in November of 2020, 6 months later, and it was completely flipped. 75% or so of the respondents turned around and said, oh, the minute the office reopens, I'm going to go back. And the number one reason why they wanted to go back is because they miss their coworkers. We are social beings. We want to be together. So I think what this changes, what AI does, is it changes everything about office design, but it doesn't do away with the office as a asset class. We no longer have single contributors sitting quietly and doing ledgers. The office becomes a place to meet, to interact, to do everything that LLMs won't do, right? You can't read a room on Zoom. You can't build a rapport. You cannot effectively coach people on Zoom. So I think, yes, we will have a reduction in workforce and office using workforce, but I don't think working in an office will go away. And, after the pandemic, where everybody was just renewing in place and kicking the can down the road, because they didn't know what the office wanted to be. Nobody really knew what the design should be. So they just renewed in place saying, okay, well, let's figure this out and let's just stay where we are for now. That has already totally changed. I mean, over the last year or so, office sector's vacancy rates have dropped significantly. Premium spaces are gone. Rents are rising. Things are somewhat looking up again. And at the same time, though, and we've talked about this at length in this conversation, all the asset classes are converging. So what does the office want to be? The office will be different. Residential gets office suites so that you can work from home. Offices have hospitality features, and in some cases, they have little huddle spaces that mimic somebody's living room at home, but it's an office. And that's the environment that people want to work in. So I think the office will always be there for accidental discoveries, chance encounters, discussions that you just won't have in a scheduled call or video call. And it will accommodate neighborhoods for different types of uses. And I think it will be a fascinating evolution.
I agree with everything you say, and you've already been on the vanguard of sort of bringing together hospitality, residential, and retail into the office environment. And it sounds like the space is going to continue evolving in that direction. So, switching gears for a second, as someone who's worked for both European and US family offices, I'd love to get a sense of how your foothold in both continents has complemented your investment activities, and where you've taken sort of investment ideas from Europe and brought them to the US, or vice versa, or European sensibilities to the US.
We took our full service property management model back to Europe. And at the time, that was quite novel because Europeans were used to more of a hands-off approach with like a janitor somewhere. And that comprehensive American style service really resonated strongly with tenants over there. And I think today, if you have a Class A office building in Europe, and I'm not saying we pioneered it, I think there were a lot of people at the same time that were looking to America and saying, okay, the way they do it, that's what we need to do too. But if you go to the continent today and you're in a Class A office space, they have very similar management styles as a US Class A office building. And then, we have conversely implemented several European concepts that were just starting to gain traction in the US. And we talked about some of them, the integrated one is amenities. And then also this emphasis on long-term relationships, tenant relationships, building relationships over just transactional interactions. But Europe definitely continues to be ahead of us on sustainability. And there is a much more acute awareness with European tenants and owners that demand and are willing to pay for environmental performance. And they've been willing to do that for years. Whereas here, I think that is just setting in right now. And they really understand the connection between building wellness and human wellness. For instance, in Germany, you could never have an office that doesn't have a window. That's not allowed. Whereas here, as we talked about, some people have offices and they can't see outside. So we brought those standards and expectations back to our US properties. But it's been a beautiful cross-pollination, I would say. American innovation and efficiency meets European sustainability and long-term thinking. So it's made us better operators on both sides of the pond, I would say.
And what are your views now on investment themes for the US and for Europe? How do they differ? What are the interesting areas?
Well, I tell you, for the US, if we weren't already that office-centric, I'd buy office. I think if you are in a situation where there are generational opportunities in strategic locations with really good real estate. In Europe, it's a similar situation as here. There's a housing shortage, and this whole idea of home ownership is not as ingrained as it is in the US. So renting your home is much more normal and socially accepted, even on the high end. So I think in Europe, your best opportunities right now are residential properties, despite the fact that the euro is higher than it has been in recent years, but their interest rates are lower. So, there's an offset.
Well, speaking of Europe, in the conversations I've had with European investors of late, and from the beginning of this year until recently, there's a lot more caution about investing in US real estate, given the current administration, given tariffs, the deficit, and the dollar weakness. What are you hearing and seeing from European investors?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a little complicated. I think there's still definitely a strong desire, and the fact that the dollar is weak actually probably enhances the opportunities for Europeans. And I think the fundamentals that have always attracted European capital to the US haven't changed. The scale, liquidity, transparency, rule of law. But there's a new reticence, and the geopolitical tensions, and I think our polarized political climate, and then also especially the war in Ukraine, have really shifted European thinking about portfolio diversification. So I think the appetite to invest in the US still exists, but the approach has, like you say, become a whole lot more cautious. They're still investing, but they're a whole lot more selective, more strategic about timing, and I think also more focused on assets that can weather political uncertainty.
And for your family office, if you were starting with a blank canvas today, would you have equal weighted allocations between Europe and the US, or a heavier allocation to one geography?
If we had a choice, I think we would probably more heavily weight towards the US. There are just some vagaries in Europe right now that are difficult to predict.
Anything in particular that's, that weighs on your mind from a European perspective?
Yes. So energy is a huge issue. And so a lot of heavy industry, a lot of stuff that Germany was priding itself in will not be able to be sustainable because you just don't, the energy costs are too high for that to be continuing. And then obviously geopolitically, who knows where this is all going to end up? It's very volatile. I grew up in Germany in the 80s, and in the 80s, which is at the height of the first Cold War. And it feels a little bit like that. It's a dicey situation. And the other thing is, if you look at Europe in comparison to the US, 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, the US and Europe were about even in terms of GDP and share of world GDP. And the US is still where it was, and Europe is half of what it was. And so I think technologically, Europe has a lot of challenges that need to be addressed, and I hope they will be addressed. But as we discussed earlier, growth really comes from AI, from technology. And Europe, I think, has fallen behind because Europe has been, rather than embracing it, has been trying to regulate it.
And then to sort of end the real estate discussion on maybe a more positive note, since it sounds like you're optimistic about the US, any final thoughts on what excites you about the US and investing here now?
Well, I'm not saying it's all Pollyanna here. I'm just saying that the opportunities of growth, I think, are better here in the long run. And what excites me, I think we are a technological powerhouse. I hope we can keep this advantage because obviously China is knocking on the door. And I'm very bullish on the future of the American economy. I think we go through a whole lot more peak cycles than Europe, for instance, because they modulate these cycles a whole lot more with entitlements and benefits and so on and so forth that the US isn't doing. But the benefit of that is that you recover from things much faster because it's the optimal allocation of capital to whatever drives the next boom.
Before we wrap up, I always like to ask guests if they could provide a recommendation for something that's not real estate related, whether that's a book, a philosophy, a life hack, anything you have to say on that front.
Yeah, sure. So this might sound a little bit philosophical, but I believe that everybody has a choice in how they want to live their lives. And you can approach life as a comedy, as a tragedy, as a drama, or your hero story. And most people default to drama when you listen really closely. Everything's urgent, everything's a crisis, and they're always reacting. And then many people live in a tragedy, constantly focused on what's wrong and what's missing and what's unfair and so on. And I think, what I've learned is choose to be the protagonist of your own hero story. Heroes face challenges, but they are actively shaping their narrative. And they see obstacles as plot points and not as endings of the story. And so I think that has been an overriding motto in my life. And honestly, comedy is also a great option. When you can laugh at the absurdity of situations, it makes life a whole lot easier too. So yeah, my motto is be the protagonist, write your own story, and stop waiting for things to happen to you and start making things happen for you.
That's wonderful advice. Sabina, thank you so much for joining us today. Your work exemplifies what it means to lead with vision, values, and intentionality. We'll be watching closely as you continue to shape cities and energy for the future.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a privilege.
Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Forum, a podcast brought to you by the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at Columbia Business School. Be sure to subscribe for more insights from real estate thought leaders, industry professionals, faculty, and the latest research and expertise from the Milstein Center's Research Lab at Columbia Business School. If you've enjoyed the episode, please follow, rate, and share the podcast. You can keep up to date with the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate at business.columbia.edu/real estate. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time.